Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Anthony's Antics podcast. This episode I thought I'd try and sort of go back and do a retrospective of my, belief system, where my beliefs have come from, what I believe, why I believe it, and sort of what my, orientation is with regard to spiritual beliefs. I think sometimes in attempting to come to an understanding of each other, we just take on face value what people say and what they believe, and we sort of tend to judge a little bit too harshly. Not that I'm expecting to be judged and therefore I'm sort of preempting that, but oftentimes we don't understand why people come to believe what they believe. You know, we haven't walked a mile in their shoes. We don't know what experiences they've had. We don't know what realizations they've had in the privacy of their own home. Late at night, perhaps reading a book and having meaningful experiences in relation to what they're reading, you know, having deep realizations about things and making philosophical connections. So we don't know. We often don't know why people believe what they believe. And I think I find that a difficult thing sometimes as I'm going through my normal workaday life. We live in a very skeptical society these days. If something isn't immediately practical or applicable to the way we live our mechanistic life in 2017, then people tend to be skeptical of that. You know, they tend to not really get it. At least that's what I've observed. But again, I don't know what they're experiencing in the privacy of their own home either. They might have beliefs, they just choose not to share them. And that's a big problem I find. People don't seem to want to share beliefs. They don't seem to want to open up. People don't trust. In this day and age of atheism and skepticism and rationalism and materialism, people seem very, very reluctant to sort of open up and either explore new realms or either to share their own personal private experiences. It just seems a shame to me. Anyway, with that rambling out of the way, what I want to try and talk about is my personal beliefs and my experiences growing up and what has sort of formed my belief system. I guess to start off with, I was raised in a Christian tradition. Parents were both of Irish Catholic extraction, and in their own way the church meant a lot to them. Regular Sunday attendances at Mass, rain, hail or shine, never missed a weekend. And they made sure that we went along as well. I didn't really mind going to church, especially when I was quite young. One of my most vivid memories of church as a young boy was at St. Philomena's Church in Bathurst, New South Wales, Australia. And a hymn was being sung. I believe it was called Make Me a Channel of Your Peace, something along those lines. And as a young child, for some reason, that song really struck a major chord with me. I love music anyway. Music is another one of my big loves. And so the musical part of the services, you know, was always nice for me. I enjoy music, find it's relaxing, soothing, especially the church hymns. And so that song, Make Me a Channel of Your Peace, I remember one Sunday hearing that song and thinking to myself, yes, God, that's what I want. I want you to make me a channel of your peace. I wanted to be that for God. I actually made a decision that I wanted to dedicate myself to being a channel to God's peace. And I probably was only about 5 or 6 years old, just a very young age, 7 years old perhaps. And so there you go. So straight away, right from an early age, I had my own religious experiences, religious convictions. I had no problem with the church or with religion. Religion seemed like a good thing. I think as a young child, I had already had a sense that God was real. And I guess that's the big difference in consciousness with people like myself and with people like, say, Richard Dawkins, who don't have that automatic orientation towards religion and towards a sense of God. You know, Richard Dawkins relates it at an early age. I'm no expert on Dawkins, but from what I understand, at an early age, you know, he was very quick to reject religion. And you know what? That's fine. That's his path. But what Richard doesn't understand is other people have a different path. Other people have different experiences. And no, we're not being deceived by our parents or the church. I actually felt like I knew a lot more about God and religion at a very young age than my parents did. My parents were there very clearly just because it was their tradition. They went along to church because that's what they felt they should do to be good Catholics. I could tell my parents weren't particularly spiritual people right from the get-go. I knew that. I knew that my parents weren't very emotionally available or emotionally sympathetic towards me as a child. That was evident very early on. So I was under no illusions about my parents. I was adopted, so I think that gave me a little extra objectivity. You know, my parents weren't particularly of the emotional type. Again, they were that pragmatic Irish Catholic type. They didn't indulge my dreams or my finer, more sensitive feelings. And so I could tell that I wasn't being taken in by my parents' traditions. You know, if anything, I had a deeper understanding of them, even from a young age, I believe. Sounds arrogant, but that's how I felt. So from an early age, you know, I was already very sensitive to God and to Jesus. You know, the teachings of Jesus in the Bible, to me, came across very powerfully indeed. I mean, here was clearly a figure who stood up to the forces of his time. He was not prepared to brook the establishment's hypocrisy in any way. And that's a big influence on me. I mean, that's how I feel. Again, sounds arrogant perhaps, but that's how I feel now. I feel like society tries its best to impose a one-size-fits-all regime framework on all the human inhabitants of that society. But society is never going to be a good fit for everyone. I felt that more keenly, perhaps, just to digress for a moment, in my teens and 20s. Society to me just seemed like a hypocritical place. You know, we had the Cold War with the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, politicians posturing at each other, and meanwhile nothing being done to help people's quality of life, to help people eat good fresh food, you know, to have access to good medicine. The whole orientation seemed to be arm ourselves up as much as possible so we can be safe from the enemy, but meanwhile it doesn't matter if injustice or starvation occurs because we're strong, you know, we've got our military backing. I could go on and on. But basically, yeah, so Jesus struck a very early chord with me as someone who was clearly a revolutionary thinker, but he was not a soldier. And that's the amazing thing about Jesus. You know, he was a revolutionary, but as he quite clearly said, his kingdom was not of this world. He was not a political revolutionary, as some have tried to paint him in this modern materialistic age. Jesus was a spiritual revolutionist. Jesus was telling us to reorient our inner consciousness. You know, he who lusteth after a woman has already committed adultery with her. That teaching is about inner states. It's about how you are on the inside rather than what you do on the outside. And I've digressed quite a bit. But I guess what I'm saying, yes, so from a very early age, religion, God and Jesus had a very, very big impact on me. I didn't necessarily think that the sacraments were anything. Like Holy Communion to me just seemed like a bizarre thing. You all get up and line up and eat this crunchy bit of wafer. You know, church teachings tell us that the bread and wine at the Eucharist become the body and blood of Christ. I don't believe that really personally. I don't think that's a real thing. However, I do believe that substances can be charged with the, you know, the magnetism of the person doing the ceremony, and they can be blessed. I believe things can be blessed. I believe things can be cursed, for that matter. And if the bread and wine is blessed with the intention of Christ's love, with the intention of channeling down a beneficent energy into that substance, just like a faith healing, a hands-on healing, where someone might do a Reiki healing, and they might charge that person's aura with positive healing energy being channeled through from the divine source. The same thing can apply to the Eucharist. It might not be literally Jesus' body and blood. There are miracles out there to do with Jesus' body and blood, and I'm not denying those, but I'm just saying as a general rule of thumb, I never thought that the Eucharist was anything as a child. But as I say, I just had an innate connection or feeling of connection to something to do with God and Jesus and religion. So that was my starting point. That's my jumping off point. And, you know, growing up from that tender age where I had that first religious conviction, nothing much really altered or changed. I was never one to have mystical experiences so much as a child. I did have one incident where, standing in the kitchen of my parents' home, there was no one else around. I seemed to be the only one there. I can't remember what time of day. Oh, well, it was during the day. I can't remember what time of year it was, if it was school holidays and Dad was at work. I just can't remember. But no one was in the kitchen. And I remember just standing there and already sort of going into a funny, like, meditative zone. And before me in midair, above my head height, again, I was a child, and this was up towards, I guess, the ceiling, a shape appeared. A very distinct shape appeared in the air before me. And it seemed to have a geometric sort of shape to it, almost as if it was, so it was a squarish shape is what I want to say. And I remember seeing this shape in the air and just thinking, wow, that's so trippy. It was like it was transparent, I guess. It didn't have a particular colour that I can ascribe to it. But yeah, I remember just feeling a sense of peace looking at this funny square in the air. Who knows what that even means? I mean, a square relates to the earth plane, the plane of matter, you know, the four corners of the earth. So perhaps it had something to do with that. I don't know. I've never had any deeper insight into the strange hovering square in my childhood. But my childhood was also marked with a lot of alienation, as I mentioned before, and not trying to denigrate my parents, but this was my experience of my childhood. I didn't feel like my parents were really there for me emotionally. Their level of pragmatism was such that I just did not feel validated in that way by them. You know, that's a shame, but that's how it was. And so, but isn't that interesting that I did not reject the religion of my parents, because religion carried its own meaning and significance for me. I knew that I was getting a heck of a lot more out of my church attendance than my parents were getting out of theirs. I remember once talking to Mum about religion and spirituality and God, and she's a funny one. My mum can be she used to be a lot more aggressive. My mother used to be quite loud and aggressive and sort of trying to corral us kids, I guess. My dad, much more soft. My dad has a philosophical bent to him. My dad would at least try and think about things and contemplate things and quote some of the church fathers, Thomas Aquinas, etc. But I remember my mother saying that she really wants to believe in God, she's just not sure. So despite going to church every Sunday her entire life, despite hearing the Bible readings, despite all this and that, you know, and despite hearing my father and I engaged in philosophical discussion, it really never rubbed off for my mother. You know, she really embodies that pragmatism that we are living through at this time. She wanted desperately to believe, but she had no inner conviction. And that's a big thing for me. And that's where I differ from my parents, particularly my mother, is that I have always had that inner conviction. And I guess that brings us now to something I alluded to in the last episode, which is that atheistic period I went through. I'm pretty sure it was my late teens. Now, I was born 73 in December. Looking back, I feel like this atheistic period coincided with the Gulf War, because to me that just seemed like, wow, there can't be a God. Look at all this, you know, that's happening in the world, just constant war. Just people seem to be addicted to war, you know. People seem to be addicted to their technology and just flinging that at one another. It just seemed to me that humankind had not even evolved beyond a caveman mentality, still looking around for the biggest rock to throw at their skin-wearing rivals. So I believe I went through an atheistic period sometime around age 17, 18. That would coincide with the Gulf War in 91. But again, my atheism was in no way informed. It was a very uneducated atheism. It was a gut reaction to what I was perceiving in the world. It wasn't based on any reading of any atheistic literature, you know, like Marx or anyone like that. It was just purely like, screw this, there can't be a God. So that lasted maybe for a couple of years with me. But then luckily, you know, wonderful things for me were just around the corner in terms of spiritual discovery and a renaissance for me, I suppose, a personal renaissance. In 1993, I believe, either 93 or 94, a wonderful book came out called The Celestine Prophecy. People mock and deride the Celestine Prophecy, as they do any kind of spirituality or New Age philosophy. But for me, Celestine Prophecy gave me a beautiful key to a way to understand human history and the purpose of human existence without necessarily needing to refer to organized religion. This was the big breakthrough for me. This is when I realized, well, this planted the seed, I should say, of a realization that I don't need to have a spirituality that is tied to organized religion. And that's what people still don't seem to get today, is that spirituality and religion do not need to go hand in hand. You don't need to have a religion, and you don't need to belong to a religion in order to have a spiritual sensibility. God existed without religion, let's just say that. Before religion was, God was. It's been very obvious to me for a long time that religion does not have any kind of monopoly on God. You'd have to mush all the religions together to even come close, I think. So The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield came out around 94. And I mean, it just expanded my consciousness, changed my life. It made me realize that you can understand all these troubles and travails of human existence as the struggle to awaken. Awaken to what? Yes. Awaken to the fact that we are here to develop and evolve ourselves. James Redfield provides this beautiful model, quite Hegelian in its structure, but he applies the Hegelian dialectic to the very family connections. So, for example, as a child, we are born of two people. We are born of a mother and a father. Our mother represents one side of the Hegelian dialectic, the father the other. So we get truths. As the spiritual and physical products of our parents, we receive truths from both of them. Our father will stand for something, even if it's not a conscious philosophy on his part. Our father will represent something by the way he is, the way he acts, the things he believes and says. And similarly, the mother will also represent certain truths or certain approach to life, I guess, if you will. So what you have as a child of these two parents, it's like you're almost issued a challenge. Your challenge is then to blend or come up with a higher synthesis of what your mother and father represent. So an example, I guess I'll give the example of my life. So in the manner of James Redfield. So my father, as I mentioned before, he had a philosophical and spiritual side to him. He was very interested in church philosophy in particular and trying to explain spiritual belief in terms of church doctrine. However, he didn't really find a way to apply that to his everyday life. Not that I could see. He just lived a very mundane existence, 9-to-5 life. So my dad was one of those men of that generation who just incredibly hardworking. Like, he seemed to thrive on work, It's just. But as I say, he couldn't seem to blend his spiritual beliefs with the way he lived his life. He just lived his life in a very pragmatic manner, and his spiritual and philosophical musings had little bearing on that from what I could see. And my mother, again, being super pragmatic, she didn't have a spirituality as such, but she definitely was of service in her community. So she was of service to her community through such things as taking part in the school P&C committee, Catholic boys' school that I went to in Bathurst. She would help every year with the high school certificate. So she would come along, help set up the tables, be the person who walked the aisles and helped students who had a problem, had to go to the bathroom, needed a new pen, whatever it be. So she would take part in that every year. And so she was a big part of my school community. She was very active in the school community and active in the community in general. So I guess my mum represents being very active in the world, and my father, much more reclusive, but he represented having a spiritual orientation, to having a set of spiritual doctrines to live by. And so that puts me squarely in the middle. So my highest synthesis of that would be to live in a way that reflects my spiritual beliefs. And so that's my ongoing life challenge, is to try to come up with a spiritual belief system that guides and dictates the way I live my life. And you know what? Now that I'm 43, I can gradually start to see that coming together. Before, I had no connection between the two. It was very difficult to try and apply my spiritual beliefs to life, outside of things like trying to only eat organic food for purification. In terms of the food that I ate and, resisting things like genetically modified organisms, partner and I did a letter drop in our community when we both lived in Newcastle. We did a letter drop about the dangers of GMO foods. I wrote to the newspaper. So I guess there was those ways in which I tried to apply my spiritual beliefs. But yeah, only now, as I'm sort of, halfway through almost my 40s, am I starting to apply my spiritual beliefs more to how I live, in a more tangible, perhaps, way. So yeah, so discovering the Celestine Prophecy, and along with that, a wonderful book by Barbara Brennan called Light Emerging, and its companion volume, Hands of Light. So the Celestine Prophecy gave me a philosophical and historical framework to understand spirituality as it works itself out on the earth plane. But Light Emerging gave me, I guess, a practical approach to spirituality on the physical level. So in Light Emerging, we learn about the human aura, the human energy field, and how this is an energy that is not detectable by mainstream science, but it has been detected by such methods as Kirlian photography. the human aura has actually been photographed. And of course, all knowledge of that has just been politely shunted to one side, swept under the carpet. And the human aura is so important because it comes from the chakras. So your 7, there are probably more, but the 7 primary chakras, starting from the root chakra around the groin area, the sacral chakra in the lower belly, the solar plexus chakra in the upper belly, the heart chakra, the throat chakra, the brow chakra, and the crown chakra. Those 7 chakras go to generate, the way I understand it at least, the human aura, the human energy field. And the quality of our aura will depend on the quality of our chakras. And the quality of our chakras, in turn, is dependent on how we are disposed towards the issues that the chakras represent. So if we have a damaged root chakra, if we've had sexual problems in life, sexual abuse, then our root chakra might be damaged. We might be lacking in vitality. That's just one example. Or for me, the classic is the throat chakra. I have had a plethora of throat issues, neck issues, nothing serious medically, but just certainly in adulthood, I've become very conscious of tension in my throat, like a constriction feeling, which I have been working on, for many years to try and heal that. And relating to last episode of the podcast where I discovered that I could be the parent, be my own parent, I've been engaging in compassionate dialogues with my throat area. So where we have childhood traumas around a particular issue that relates to a particular chakra, perhaps with communication, speaking up, we didn't feel validated in speaking up by our parents. And so that can impact the quality of your throat chakra. So, you might not feel you can speak up confidently in adulthood because you couldn't do it in childhood. So I was getting all these amazing insights that were not Christian. They were not coming from a Christian tradition per se, but knowledge of the chakras, knowledge of the spiritual evolution that takes place upon the earth plane. These could all be perhaps considered Gnostic, perhaps. They could also be considered part of the secret tradition of Christianity, which I'll get to later. So that was the next step on my journey. So having been raised in a Christian environment and then sort of switching into an atheistic mode for a couple of years of my life, and then finally rediscovering a New Age spirituality. For me, the New Age philosophies that I discovered were themselves a higher synthesis. They were a way to rise above the duality of Orthodox religion, Christianity, versus having to go the other side to atheism. How more people have not embraced New Age philosophy and spirituality is an absolute mystery to me, because people don't want organized religion so much anymore. But most people probably wouldn't want to go all the way to atheism either, because that just seems like an empty, barren philosophy. And how more people haven't cottoned on to all the wonderful New Age books that you can find in bookstores, I just don't get it. And while we're on this subject, a lot of people disparage the New Age community now. That's what I'm finding. They narrow in on certain aspects of New Age belief, and they mock and ridicule. And to me, again, I don't understand, because it's like, how can knowledge of the aura and the chakras, how can knowledge of karma be anything but a good thing? Because I guess for me, my lifelong quest has been to build a spiritual doctrine, one that can be not just one that exists in an abstraction, but a spiritual doctrine that helps one understand the phenomena of life and also helps one live a better quality of life. And so that's where I was at in my early 20s. So I discovered the human aura, discovered the chakras. And I guess the next big step for me was I discovered healing. So one day I was hanging out with a friend. He lived in a flat on the second story of the building. Leading to the door of his flat were stairs going up and then an outside sort of landing. And one night, in a drunken state, I decided, because I was quite gung-ho as a young man, I've got Mars in Aries, that heroic complex. and I was drunk and high-spirited, so I literally threw myself off the landing. I grabbed hold of the top railing, threw myself over the side to see if I could do it. I had no thought of the consequences. I just wanted to leap over the balcony. That's the kind of guy I was. Halfway over the railing, I realized what the hell I was doing. I was about to fall, and I tried to grab onto the railing, and I twisted my abdomen in a very odd way, and I made myself feel very strange inside, like I'd bent myself, and I fell to the ground and whatnot. It wasn't hurt too bad, but I left myself with a very strange feeling in my abdomen. And then later, as I was sort of making my way home, I was sitting in a park and feeling this pain in my abdomen and going, my goodness, what am I going to do about this pain? Like I said, I'd already read Light Emerging a few years before, and I just had this feeling to put my hand on the area of the pain. So I put my hand on the abdomen where the pain was. And even, I was actually drunk at the time. That's the strange thing about this. I was still intoxicated. But even so, I was able to channel healing energy into myself just spontaneously, and I healed the pain. The pain went. And I think the moral of the story for me is that consciousness is energy. As an idealist, in the philosophical sense of idealism, not the small I idealism of having ideals, as a philosophical idealist, I believe that consciousness made everything. Consciousness generated this universe. You know, that consciousness, of course, being the mind of God. And as we partake of consciousness in ourselves, then we have the power to direct energy and direct matter as well, you know, to a certain extent, depending on our level of ability. And so I was able to channel healing energy into that pain. The next landmark for me was meeting my partner, who is still my current partner. And she introduced to me one or two more things. First of all, the tarot. Now, at that same friend's place that I mentioned where I tossed myself off the balcony, I was staying over there. And, you know, I would often just sleep over at his place. It was a way to get out of my parents' house, you know, which had become pretty intolerable by that time. She had with her treasured tarot deck, which was a version of the Rider-Waite deck, which very bold, striking colours, not heavy on detail. You can't see a lot of detail in the deck, but very striking, strong lines, strong colours. And having been raised in the Christian tradition, I hadn't fully shaken off the, I guess, the fears, the superstitions of that tradition. And on first seeing a tarot deck, I was immediately, like I was on the defensive. I was like, I mean, I was raised to believe these things were the work of the devil, so I hadn't fully, you know, shaken these things off. And so when I first saw the tarot deck, I was quite wary. I think I allowed her to do a brief reading for me, but that's where that temporarily stopped for me, my fascination with tarot. But what I found was not long after meeting my partner, I actually moved to Newcastle, as I mentioned, with a different friend. And Susan later joined me at Newcastle. My friend then left and returned to Bathurst, where we were both from. And so Susan and I stayed on together in Newcastle. And what I found... Now, this is where it gets a bit more real. So in Newcastle, no spiritual belief was of any help to me at all at first, because what I experienced was like an initiation. So we start to go a little deeper now. We start to head into the realm of Hades or Pluto in astrology. And that is the realm of, you know, the darkness, the underground, and the realm of potential death, I suppose, either death or rebirth, you know, sink or swim. In Newcastle, what I found was being in a very, you know, unfamiliar place, away from all the familiar things of childhood, away from family and any friends. What I very quickly found was I started having emotional breakdowns. I'd already had a few emotional breakdowns in Bathurst, like just of the nature of losing it occasionally, like emotionally just going off, crying. So, you know, so I'd already had a few bad experiences in my early 20s in Bathurst, but nothing compared to what Newcastle had in store for me. I quickly found that I was, again, having those emotional breakdowns, crying, feeling traumatized for no apparent reason. There was a suicide attempt. And then upon seeking help from a GP, I quickly was diagnosed with clinical depression, and I was prescribed a mild antidepressant. So that was an encounter with a bit of realness for me. And what the doctor actually told me very, very perceptively was that I rationalize my emotions too much. Like, I don't just let myself feel. And so this was a very necessary part of my growth. As someone who's a double Sagittarian, who's very interested in things of the mind and philosophy, we can't forget our emotions. And, you know, going back to Barbara Brennan's Light Emerging, our emotions tend to be frozen in childhood around areas of pain that we experience in the actual body. So when we experience an emotional pain as a result of childhood trauma, that pain gets frozen, that consciousness gets frozen, locked in somewhere in our bodies. And so the trauma persists, and occasionally it might leak out, it might break out a little bit. it's like the beach ball. We're holding down the beach ball underwater, but occasionally the beach ball will pop back up and there's all our ugliness, on display for all to see. And that's what was happening to me in Newcastle. And the reason I tried to take my own life is because I felt so traumatized. And despite all my spiritual study up to that time, I mean, I was only in my late 20s, so, it's not as if... And I really struggled in life. Like, I dropped out of university, so I didn't have a degree. Despite being an intelligent person, I just couldn't get myself off the ground. Like, I just couldn't get anywhere. It was very difficult. And so this is where my beliefs coincided with physical reality. However, the amazing thing that got me through this time was my partner and I together discovered astrology. The library across the road from us had an amazing selection of books for a start, for a small library in a nowhere suburb in Newcastle. But also they had internet available. And so that was when Susan and I really started getting to the internet around about 2001. And discovering astrology gave me huge insights. Astrology was a massive missing piece of my jigsaw puzzle. As I was later to discover, there is astrology underpinning much of religion. Even Christianity has astrological aspects to it, if you look into it. And so I discovered astrology, and I discovered that what I was going through was due to a particularly difficult transit. The planet Pluto, in its current position in the sky, was conjuncting my natal sun in the 12th house. And so as anyone who's had that will know, particularly if it's a 12th house transit, because the 12th house is the house of self-undoing. There you go. I tried to completely undo myself, but it wasn't my time, it wasn't my time to pass on. Pluto was asking me to find strength. It was asking me not to die, but to be reborn. And so with the knowledge of astrology and being equipped also with the tarot, which I'd been studying as well, when my friend left to go back to Bathurst, I bought my own tarot deck and started getting into a tarot off my own bat. Tarot being a wonderful system of symbolism and a way of understanding the human journey, the human archetypes that live within the soul, the psyche, I suppose, and a way also of understanding the human journey. Tarot is a wonderful complement to astrology. They're both concerned with, our journey through life. And in the modern view of astrology, they're both concerned with coming to understand our inner self so that we can evolve and grow and live out the full potential of our astrology charts at the highest optimum level, as opposed to just being in the old mentality of astrology, which was this fatalistic, deterministic mentality, which no astrologer holds to that anymore. I mean, maybe some Vedic astrologers might still have a fatalistic approach, but not in the West. In the West now, we believe that astrology is for growth, self-understanding, understanding of others, understanding of dynamics in relationships. I mean, look, astrology I've seen borne out time and time again in understanding how other people work, understanding how I work, understanding current events in the life from transits and also from progressions. This is not the time to go into astrology in any depth. Perhaps I'll do that in a future episode. But I guess the next big turning point for me in my spiritual journey was a book I found in 2007 when I used to work across Sydney Harbour at Mossman. A very picturesque commute to work that was. But yes, there was a bookshop at Mossman called Pages and Pages. And as a person, obviously, who loves bookshops, I went in there one lunchtime during a work day, and I saw this very mysterious, almost dark-looking book sitting on the bookshelf called The Secret History of the World by Jonathan Black. The cover had a very dark scene of two people who looked like adepts performing some kind of arcane rite, perhaps. But I was immediately transfixed. I really hadn't gone into the esoteric much, despite having been, interested in tarot, astrology, auras, chakras. All those things had been a little on the superficial side in a way. Like, I hadn't investigated any of the philosophical underpinnings of these things of Western society. But having found this book, I knew I had to buy it as soon as I saw it. It was the hardback version. As soon as I bought it and read it, I was just immediately transfixed. I just couldn't believe what I'd discovered. This amazing book shows how you can connect everything from, God and how he created the universe with the different levels of angels, to the different historical phases of the Earth's history, with astrology, with alchemy. It's very hard to do this book justice in a brief summary. What it helped me realize is how everything hangs together, or, you can see things in a way that they hang together, similar as I learned from Celestine Prophecy, but this book takes it to the next level. It gives the full historical background as to the tradition of thought. And that's what it is. The secret history of the world is a history of human thought and how different phases of human thought have contributed to the way we are today. So the way human consciousness is structured today, how the structure of the solar system and the positions of the planets form our consciousness, what the purpose of this all is, what the aim of evolution is, which I guess if you wanted a quick summary, the aim of evolution is that individual spirits coming from God, which is us, human beings, would eventually achieve a state of free will and the ability to love freely. So I guess the whole aim of our existence on this earth is to discover love, even in the face of the difficulties that we experience, and also the ability to have a powerful free will so that we might be God's ambassadors to all corners of the cosmos, in terms of how free-willing and how free-loving we are, and how powerfully we can move through all the realms of existence. So that amazing book has just been another massive cornerstone for me, Jonathan Black's Secret History of the World, if you're interested in philosophy and history, as I am. And I heartily recommend people check that out as well. The next turning point for me would have been coming across The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, the book by Lee Bagent and, of course, Lee, Lincoln and Bagent. Yes, of course. Holy Blood, Holy Grail opened my eyes to the fact that there were other traditions than the organized religion. It opened my eyes to Gnostic traditions, to Cathar traditions. I guess they gave me the awareness of the tradition of the demiurge. And what that relates to is that Gnostics and Cathars tended to believe that the world was not created by a benevolent God, but was in fact created by, I guess, a fallen angel. And the world is therefore, and matter is therefore, inherently evil. And we need to try and escape from the world. Kind of like an Eastern Buddhist philosophy, really, in some ways. And, obviously during this time I'm reading a lot more books, greater variety of books, but this was a big standout for me, discovering Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and reading subsequent books on that in that vein as well. And I suppose continuing along that theme, coming into more recent times now, from about 2013 or 14 up till now, one of my biggest discoveries has been, first of all, the books of an author called Timothy Wiley. And along with that, a book that he draws on very heavily in his writings, which is the Urantia book. Now, interestingly enough, the Urantia book and the books of Timothy Wiley advocate the idea that, yes, the world is a result of a fallen angel, or the world as it is the result of a fallen angel. However, the slight tweak that Urantia book gives is that the world, everything was created by God. There's no question of that. There's no creation without God. God is the only creator. A fallen angel cannot create. But what the fallen angel did was corrupt. The Urantia book is a book that is apparently channeled, I think, in the 1930s under the auspices of the Kellogg family, of all people, in New York. And the Urantia book purports to be channeled from celestial beings who belong to, I guess, the universal authority, you could say. So the Urantia book envisions that inner realms, the inner dimensions of energy that are not visible to the physical eye, but these dimensions exist on inner planes, which we will be able to access when we die and pass from this physical plane into the spiritual planes. But on the spiritual planes, the Urantia book posits that is a whole hierarchy of angelic beings who administer the universe at all different levels. So, for example, the Urantia book posits that there is a central universe where God dwells, and then outside that central universe there are 7 super universes, and there are beings who preside at the level of the super universe. Each of those super universes, 7 of them, has in turn 100,000 local universes, making a total of 700,000 universes, which are arranged in some kind of pattern around the central universe, the central Havona, I believe they refer to it as. And so there are beings that dwell at the level of the local universe. And now this is where Jesus comes in, and this is absolutely fascinating to me. Obviously, we know from organized religion, from Christianity, that Jesus is called the Son of God. We don't quite know how that happens, but that's what he's known as, and that's what he declared himself to be, Son of Man and Son of God. But the Urantia book posits a fascinating idea, that Jesus was a man, obviously. Jesus was his earthly name, but that is not his spiritual name. As a spiritual being dwelling on the inner planes and administering the local universe, Jesus' true name is said to be Michael of Nabodon. And Nabodon is the name of our particular universe. So the place that we find ourselves when we look out into the night sky, that universe has a name, and it's called Nabodon. Our planet is called Urantia. That's why the name of the book is the Urantia book. And Michael of Nabodon, as he is known in the inner planes, is the son of this universe. So he is a direct, I guess, creation of God, making him a son of God. And Michael is the ruler, I suppose you could say, of our local universe, together with the Divine Mother. So every local universe is said to have a creator son, that's his technical rank, and a Divine Mother, and together the creator son and the Divine Mother downstep and channel the energy, the intense creative energy pouring out from the central universe to fashion the matter and the physical beings of our local physical universe. Now, it's interesting to note that Jesus does not create our souls. So Michael of Nabodon fashions the universe in which souls will inhabit, but only God creates souls. So to my mind, the Urantia book's theories really help resolve a lot of the confusions and apparent contradictions around the teachings of organized religion. And I'm inclined to accept what the Urantia book says, because the way it presents itself is, and this is, to me, this is how I know a source is likely to be credible. It doesn't try and prove its arguments. It simply gives them to you. It simply puts forward its theories, its notions of how the universe and how the cosmos is structured, and it doesn't try and prove or justify anything. It just gives the structure, and it's up to the reader whether to accept or reject the whole notion. And as I say, for me, having Michael of Nabodon, or as we know him, Jesus Christ, as a creator of the universe, it makes perfect sense. It accounts for why he was called the Logos, or the Word of creation, because he did create a universe. He created our universe. So this is why Jesus had the power to do certain miracles. Interestingly, the Urantia book says that not everything Jesus did was in fact a miracle, but many of the things he did, such as the feeding of the 5,000, was indeed a miracle. So again, you have to be discerning when you read the Bible. You can't just take the Bible, as read, and neither can you reject the Bible. You have to have discernment, and that's been a big part of my spiritual quest. Having discernment, when you read things about spiritual matters. So anyway, so the Urantia book states that Jesus is the creator of our universe. Isn't that interesting? Or perhaps to be more accurate, Jesus shapes our local universe according to the intentions of the Father in heaven, the God dwelling in the central universe. So once again, Jesus did not claim to be God. He says, I only do the will of my Father. That was his beautiful and very humble claim. Despite being, at the level of creator son of a universe, one of the highest ranks that exist in the inner planes, Jesus could only say, I do the will of my Father in heaven. So Jesus is a creator of our universe according to the scheme laid out in the great cosmic vision of God. So God dwells in the central universe. God's dream, God's vision for creation is transmitted to Jesus in his role as creator son, and then he, together with the Divine Mother, shapes our universe and all the angels, actually. That's another interesting point. The Divine Mother is said to create all the angels of our universe. The books by Timothy Wiley, the Rebel Angel series, are channeled by an angel called Georgia. And Georgia readily admits that all angels are created from the Divine Mother herself. So that's the creatrix of our universe, whereas Michael is the creator. It's very interesting stuff. The Urantia book and Timothy Wiley's books have really opened my mind even more. I always know when a book is important to me because I feel my mind being opened and challenged in new directions. And I always very thoroughly test any new knowledge that comes my way to see if it does fit with what I already know and believe and my inner convictions. Timothy Wiley has been investigating non-human intelligence for decades. You know, he's worked with dolphins and had amazing experiences with dolphins, and his learning and his study and his personal growth have led him to this area of rebel angels, and to the point now where he has a rebel angel, or a reformed rebel angel, we hope, Georgia, working with him to write his Rebel Angel series of books, which I give a very heartfelt recommendation for Confessions of a Rebel Angel by Timothy Wiley, available from Inner Traditions, Bear and Company, and also on Kindle as well. So that's where I'll leave it. Next time, I guess we'll be tackling the Rebel Angels. Okay, take care now. Bye-bye.